Hi everybody, welcome back to Speedway Motors. My name's Tim. So glad to have you join us again, as I always am. I love talking to you about some of the parts and products and some of the things we have going on here. If you've tuned into some of my other videos, you know at home I'm working on my dream car. It's a 29 Ford Roadster, all steel, on deuce rails. It's the car I've always wanted. It's got a 241 red Ram Hemi in it, but this is a car I want to drive. All my traditional friends are ribbing me. They say, Tim, you got to go old on all your parts. I decided to go with a T-5 transmission, so they give me a little static about that, but there's a good reason why. And a lot of hot rodders out there, probably some of you that are listening to this, have T-5s in your hot rods, and there's a good reason. It's because they're available, and they're reasonable, and they work really well. And having that fifth gear is awful nice when you're heading down the road. And I want to drive this car like nobody's business. I want to take it in and show it to all my friends when I'm done, so I want to be able to go on some road trips. So I went out and I found my T-5, and when you're looking for a T-5, there are a lot of things to consider. You got to consider if you need a world class or a non-world class, because those are the major variations. The world class is a little bit beefier. It's got better bearings and different synchronizer discs in it, so it's going to be set up for a little higher horsepower applications. For me, that's not important. It really didn't matter so much if it was world class or non-world class, but to some of you that may be a factor. The more important thing to me was shifter location. When somebody looks in my car, I want it to look like it has an old original Ford transmission in it. You know, and they'll tell you look under the car, you won't know the difference. So I wanted to have a shifter that was in the right spot so I could run my bench seat. I didn't have to worry about it cutting into my seat. So an S10 transmission was the only way to go for me. Now, T5s came in a lot of different vehicles, Camaros, Firebirds, S10 pickups, Mustangs, you name it. There's a lot of different cars that ran the Borg Warner T5. It's now owned by Tremec, incidentally, but it's good transmission. I bought my first one. It was out of an S10. I thought, you know what, I better check this thing out. And I would recommend you do this. Pull the top cover off, take a look at it, make sure it's healthy. When I pulled mine apart, I was about ready to install it in the car, but then something told me I better check it out. It was all full of gear teeth. Somebody had given that thing a rough life. It was all shelled out. The high gear was all stripped out, and it was bad news. So what I decided to do is part that transmission out and start looking for another one. Well, I found one. A buddy of mine had this transmission, which is a low mileage transmission. It came out of a Camaro, but the only problem with it is the shifter location's wrong. So what a lot of guys do is they build a hybrid T5 where they'll take a T5 that was out of something else and then they'll put the S10 tail housing on it. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to take you along with me while I take this thing apart. I'm going to warn you, I'm not a transmission expert. I'm just a gearhead hot rodder, so I'm not sure I'm going to get it 100% right, but hopefully I can show you some tips and tricks along the way and we can figure it out together. So let's take this thing apart and see what's going on. Okay guys, so here we have it. This is my T5. This one actually doesn't have a tag on it. When you buy a T5, always look. There'll be a little tag hanging from one of the tail housing mounting bolts that tells you everything you'd ever want to know about your particular T5. The casting numbers on the case and on the tail housing, they don't do anything for you, so always look for that tag. This one doesn't have it, so I'm pretty darn sure this came out of a Camaro. The good news is the gearing all seems to be about what I'm looking for, so I'm pretty happy with it. I'm going to take it apart. We're going to get all the S10 stuff put on it, so we'll have ourselves a little bit of a hybrid, and I'll show you how. Along the way, hopefully some of these tips will help you out if you have to do the same thing. I'm going to get my S10 parts out of the way. We're not going to need those for a little while. We'll work on taking this thing apart first. We'll start with the shifter itself. Get that out of the way. It's a 13mm bolt. We'll just get this off. Sometimes these come off kind of hard. They can be siliconed on. This one looks like it's going to be pretty easy. It wiggles a little bit. As with anything, you'll want to keep all your stuff in line and out of the way. Keep good track of it so when you've got to put things back together, everything's good. The shifter comes off and you'll find a little plastic cup in here. Don't lose this. This is actually a really important part, and sometimes when guys rebuild T5 transmissions, they forget to put this back in and it'll cause a rattle and all kinds of noise. Good to have this. We'll lube it up pretty well when we put it back together, so I'm going to put that over here. The next area to be concerned about and to consider is taking off the actual shifting mechanism itself. There's a pin you have to drive out of this shaft before the tail housing will come off. So I'm going to do that now. You basically just have to use a punch and drive this pin in. And it's really important when you do this to get the pin all the way out. And I've got the one out of my old transmission. You always think you drove it all the way through, but there's actually still a little bit of a piece of a roll pin in there. So get that completely out, because when you go to put the transmission back together, some guys will put a new pin in there, drive it in, but then if they ever have to take the transmission apart, there's no place for that first pin to go to get the old one out of the way. So what happens is you have to cut this thing all apart, and it's a disaster. There's really no easy way to do it. So I can't stress enough, get the pin out, keep it, and don't lose track of it. Make sure you got it completely out before you reinstall it. Very important. So I've got this pin driven in far enough. And that was pretty darn easy if I get my punch out of there. And then this should just kind of slide back, and sure enough, there it goes. Once you get this out, excuse me, there's a little bit of a ball and a spring in here that'll come out, and it's important not to lose track of those either. I've got the one out of the old transmission, and I'll show you this one when we get it apart. Very important to keep those pieces. While I'm at it, I'm going to take the speedo sender off this thing. This one's set up with an electronic speedo sensor. I'm going to pop that off right now and get it out of the way so that's not interfering with anything. And it's just that easy. That's a little geared sender, pretty slick. You can get that out of the way. And we'll just keep moving down the line. Next, you got to work on your housing bolts themselves. Need a little bit of an extension for this guy, but we'll get it out of the way. Looks like somebody siliconed these bolts. So that makes me believe that this transmission's been rebuilt at one time, probably not too long ago. The important thing to know is on these particular bolts, you only need sealer on the top too. The other ones all go into blind holes, so it's not important to seal them up like this. They're coming out real easy. Now, if Santa granted me my wish, when we get this thing open, it'll all look nice and clean inside. I'm going to set all my bolts over here so I don't lose track of them. There's 8 total. And now that I have those off, yeah, it popped. You can hear the shifting mechanism. There's the little spring. It just goes in this little hole, and then a little ball sits on the end of that spring. And it's pretty ingenious, and I'll use the S10 to kind of show you how that works, but it just shows you your track for all your different gears, and that little ball fits inside the sector there and makes for a really nice shift movement. But again, I can't stress enough, don't lose that little ball and don't lose that spring. They're very, very important. So with that said, it looks like this tail housing is going to pop right off, and sure enough, here it comes. And boy, I'm really happy to see there's the old tail housing. We don't need that girl anymore. Of course, they use some silicone on here, which is what you always use. There's no need for a gasket or anything. There's your high gear. Everything looks really good and clean. All the bearings look nice. Nothing to really be concerned about there. So what we'll do now is we'll work on this top cover. And these top cover bolts, there's 2 of them that are important because they have a shoulder on them. You don't want to lose them. And they're the 2 corners. You'll see they are kind of a special bolt. So don't lose those guys. We're going to need those again later. All the rest are just simple bolts, but I'll take them all off here. It's really easy when guys put these back together to over torque these top cover bolts. I've seen a lot of really goofed up threads with these when I've looked at other transmissions. And it looks like people have siliconed, whoever worked on this transmission originally siliconed or sealed these bolts too. That's not necessary. What happens is when you put silicone or thread sealer in these particular holes, they're blind holes and they're sealed actually, so they can be like a hydraulic ram and it can tear up the thread. So be really careful about that when you're assembling. You don't need to do any thread sealer on these at all. So I'm going to make a nice little pile of those. Now we're ready to take the top cover off. If you have kind of a transmission that's never been apart that's kind of reluctant, there are two places to pry on these. You'll see on each of these corners there's a little step. That's the only place you'll want to use any kind of a prying force on this top cover. The reason is the rest is kind of a gasket surface, and you don't want this thing to leak all over the place, or you don't want to cause any damage. So I'm just going to put a little light pressure on here to loosen it up on both the corners, my little pry bar. And it stuck on there better than I thought. Well, I see I missed a bolt. There's always a reason when things don't work out the way you think they're going to, and that was it. So now that I got all the bolts off, oh yeah, it's loose. Most people try to pick straight up on this. The other thing they'll try to do is take this bolt off. You don't ever want to mess with this. It's not a drain plug, it's not a fill hole. Just leave this little Allen bolt alone. This, of course, is the reverse sensor, so that's nothing to be concerned about. You can do whatever you want with that. But this one, don't play with. The two drain ports are on the other side. When you get this thing all loosened up, you kind of pick it up and shift it forward, and that lets the forks kind of come disengaged. And sure enough, this one looks real nice. All the forks are in good shape, no damage. And I would say by these little boots that this thing has been rebuilt recently. I don't see any wear to be concerned about, and everything is very clean inside, so I'm happy to see that. So that kind of gets you a look at the inside of a T-5, all the goodies in there. Boy, I wish my S10 would have looked this good. It had teeth laying all over the place, but this one's much nicer. So now we can get to work kind of dressing this thing up and getting it ready to put back together with all the S10 parts on it. So I'll start doing that now. I'm going to clean up all these surfaces really well, get all the old sealant silicone off of them. Looks like they just used a standard silicone on this devil. I don't even see any RTV or anything like that. So I'm going to be really careful about how I clean this thing up. Okay guys, so I'm getting this thing all cleaned up. Basically what I'm doing is I'm using some wax and grease remover and going around all these surfaces that are going to get a new dose of RTV, making sure they're all nice and clean and dry. At the same time, making sure I don't drop anything or have any little pieces of silicone fall into the case. I want to keep this as clean as I can. So I'm going to knock this out real quick, get it nice and spruced up, and then we can get to the next step, which will be taking the Speedo gear off along with this little snap ring. Then we'll start thinking about putting this thing back together with all the S10 goodies on it. All right, so we've got that taken care of. Next thing I need to talk a little bit about is the Speedo drive gear itself. Now, an S10 and a Camaro have them in different locations, and you can kind of see that if I move this aside for a second. I set both of these up so you can see them. You'll see the S10 actually has its located a lot closer to the main case than the Chevy Camaro or Firebird. So there's a couple ways you can get around this. You can actually just disregard the Speedo gear altogether, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually use a GPS unit for my electronic Speedo, so that takes this whole mechanism out of the equation, which is kind of handy. It's nice to live in the world of that technology. If you need a GPS sending unit, we've got them here at Speedway. They're just for a song and a dance. They make life easy. The other thing you can do is you can go through the work of actually moving this back. Some guys will actually take and create a metal sleeve to slide over, because where the actual gear rides is a little bit thicker part of the shaft, so they'll locate it where it needs to be, have a sleeve turned, and then they'll actually install that, tack weld it, and then move the gear back to where you'd need it for an S10. I'm just going to get rid of it and make my life a lot easier. I won't have to think about it, and I'm just going to plug that hole for the Speedo sensor, so no worries there. So right now I'm going to take this Speedo piece off. Let's see if I can get the snap ring undone. Okay guys, so I've got everything cleaned up now. All the mating surfaces are nice and clean. I've gone through and made sure that everything's ready for a new application of some RTV, and then we'll put this top cover back on. This will only take a second. Now, I'm working outside of my garage. If I were at home, I'd have a really nice tip where I could make this a really precise situation. Instead, I'm going to try to put this RTV on and keep it nice and thin. A lot of times people will put this on too thick and it'll kind of gush out, fall on the inside of the case, and that can cause problems. Even the factory had issues with that. So I'm going to try to put a nice light coat on here and not get too crazy. So I'll just kind of go around. It's important to go around all the bolts. Make sure you get a nice good seal on everything. There you have it. Hopefully that'll be just enough. I won't have any issues. Again, if I had a better applicator, I'd just put a nice bead around everything. But without that, I just kind of do my best here. The transmission should still be in a neutral position, so when you get ready to drop this top cover back on, it's important that you line up the teeth so they're all in line there, and that's how everything's going to go together for you. So just make sure everything's lined up that way, and when you drop this on, it's going to go on the same way that it came off. Be careful you get the forks right where they need to be. Oh yeah, and that's looking good. And it kind of goes on at an angle, and then as it engages here, oh, there it goes. It kind of slips right on. Perfect. So now we'll get our bolts in, and I'll start with the shouldered bolts. They kind of locate everything as far as the top cover is concerned. That way you don't have any guesswork with the rest of the holes. Those are those important bolts you don't want to lose. And what most guys do is they torque these down too tight. Actually, these should probably only get about 10 or 12 inch-pounds of torque, so not a lot. They have a really delicate thread. And also, you don't need to use any sealer on these bolts, so that's important to know as well. I'm going to get these guys kind of started and find my ratchet here, and we'll get them all tightened down. And as far as everything I've looked at, I've not really seen a torque sequence on these. So I'd say as long as you switch sides and kind of alternate, you should be okay. Again, just use common sense. I'm actually not going to use a torque wrench on this particular situation. I'll just use my ratchet to tighten them down here. Took me a little fumbling around in between during this video to figure out that those forks had to be spaced that way. It's very important because if you don't get that right, then everything's kind of out of whack. So be careful to get that right. Again, sometimes the best way to learn is to play around with this stuff. So again, I'm just going to kind of get these just nice and snug. And kind of alternate sides here. Again, not too tight, just enough to keep it in one place and sealed up. That should be good. Not a ton of silicone sneaking out, so that's pretty good. I kind of like the sight of that. Hopefully I got just enough in there. I'm going to kind of clean up the edges a little bit, and we should be fine. So there you have it. There's the top cover all installed, all ready to go. Everything shifts like it should, so should be all right there. So I guess what we're going to do now is start talking about putting the tail shaft back on this thing, or actually the tail housing, I should say. And everything's nice and clean on this S10. Everything's where it should be. The important things to think about right now are, of course, the mating surface. You want to make sure that's nice and clean, which this one is. I'm pretty proud of how this thing is looking. But the other thing you might want to think about too is locating all your pieces. Of course, you've got your shifter, I call it a shifter block, but also your roll pin, which is very important. Make sure the roll pin's completely out of this piece. You don't want an extra roll pin in there when you go to drive the second one in. You'll never get this off. I can't stress that enough. Also, your spring, want to have that nice and handy, and your little ball, which I have around here too. I'm going to find that little guy just sitting right over here. Of course, with all my shuffling around, I seem to have had it roll off, but I just like what I told you folks not to do. You don't want to lose your little shifter ball. They're really important. So I'm going to track mine down here. There she is. And this is where some nice tacky lube comes in handy, because as you put this on, you also need to keep all this in place so the shaft can actually engage. Make sure this is all nice and clean and lubed up. This is the point at which I'm going to lube this up a little bit anyway. So I'm going to get my grease out and we can do that so it's all ready to go. So I'll put a little grease around this guy. Put a little grease around the O-ring. A lot of guys will want to use a new O-ring up here. That's fine. It's better to grease this. Some people actually feel like they need to silicone it. You don't need to do that. Make sure this all moves nice. And then this is the point at which I'm going to start sealing this thing up with some RTV to get it ready to go. I'll just run my RTV around all the bolt holes here. And again, just a little bit goes a long way. I'm probably preaching to the choir. Most of you guys out there already know that, but want to make sure we don't have any leaks when this old girl's put together. Hot rods have a tendency to leave puddles sometimes. I don't want mine to do it if I can help it. So everything's nice and lubed up and ready to go. So this is where it's really handy to have a friend, because they can kind of help hold the transmission while you push this all together. I'm flying solo today, so you'll probably see me struggle a little bit. One thing I'll do too is I'll lube this shifter sector up really well. And you can go to town on this, no worries there. We want to make sure it's nice and sticky. And then what I'll also do is lube up the spring. We don't want it going anywhere. Insert that right where it goes. There we go. And then our little ball, we'll get that nice and sticky too. One thing we'll want to do with this is we'll want to put it in the neutral position. And it'll just stick right there. And that's important when we go to push this thing together. We'll need to push pressure down on it and slide it forward at the same time. So I'll see if we can get this thing going. I'm actually going to use my bench to kind of help me out here. But everything else looks good. Get this guy going where it needs to go. One thing I forgot about, and I'm just now thinking about, is on this S10 it actually has this ear that sticks down lower than the rest of the transmission. So that can be kind of fun when you're trying to get this thing put together. It means you'd have to lift up on the rest of the transmission. I'm going to think of another way to do this, so I don't have to worry about it. I'm going to get a little spacer block or something to put this transmission on top of and see if that'll help me. Sometimes if you have a bell housing, that helps too, because that bell housing will kind of let you set this thing up vertically, and that's helpful. Here we go. Got that in place. I'm just going to get this thing started. We're nice and close, so I'm going to grab my shifter here. Get it pushing down on this ball. If you get everything right, this guy should just seat right down on there, just like it should. There she goes, just like it's supposed to. I'm just going to start a couple of these bolts before I drive the roll pin in. These actually get torqued to 20 foot-pounds, and mine are kind of goobered up because whoever rebuilt the transmission put a ton of silicone on these. I'm going to kind of wipe them off as I go. Again, the only two you really need to worry about lubing up are the top two, because they're the only ones that enter the case. So I'm going to kind of clean these up best I can. I don't like too much crud on these things. Try to keep my threads nice and healthy. And then we'll put some sealer on the top two bolts, and that'll be good. Now, if you have a transmission that has what they call a reverse lockout, putting the tail housing on can be a little more tricky. There's actually something on the high gear sector that you have to clock at 1 o'clock. There's some videos out on the internet for that, but it's pretty rare. Not a lot of transmissions have that to worry about. So again, I got my two top bolts here. I'm going to put a little bit of sealer on. Picked this up from Speedway. This is some nice ARP thread sealer that we can use. Of course, my bolts are in some pretty bad shape. I'm going to make sure these are cleaned up a little bit better before I go monkeying around trying to seal them up. And while I'm doing this, I'll talk about what kind of fluid you'd want to put in one of these. A lot of guys ask me that. You know, what kind of fluid does a T-5 use, Tim? And actually, they just use a ATF fluid, and that's all the factory ever called for in these things. Some folks will use something thicker, but that actually causes problems, believe it or not. So that's something to consider. So we'll get this thing set up and get my torque wrench set up at 20 foot-pounds. We'll tighten these down. And again, there's not really a torque sequence on these. Just try to alternate a little bit, and that'll help out a bunch. All right, so I got all the tail housing bolts torqued to 20 foot-pounds. That's all looking good. One thing I still need to do is put the roll pin into the shift lever. Everything in here is lubed up and where it needs to be. I've got my little roll pin. Again, remember, you only need one. I just need to locate it, make sure I've got everything where it needs to go. And everything looks great. I'm going to go ahead and tap this little guy in. Just like that. One other thing I would do, this kind of had some nice light oil on it. I like to put a little bit thicker grease on it. I'm going to kind of clean it up a little bit. And then I'll put some thicker tacky lube on it, kind of keep it in place so it doesn't go anywhere. You can actually buy these if you're missing yours. Put some on the inside too. It just kind of helps that little shifter ball stay lubricated. Perfect. And there you have it. Things good to go on that. The only other thing I have to do is put my shifter in place. Of course, I've got something better in mind than this. I'm going to cut this thing off and put a big Ford shifter on it so it looks old school and cool. So this thing is going to disappear. But typically you just bolt this guy back on and you'd be all set to go. So there you can see everything. It's all assembled and looking pretty good. I'll give this a little cleanup job, polish it up a little bit, plug this hole, and I'll be ready for my hot rod. All right, folks, well, there you have it. It didn't take us too long, and it was actually pretty straightforward. Again, I'm not a transmission mechanic. I'm just a hot rodder gearhead who loves getting my hands dirty and getting into this stuff. Every time I take something apart, I learn something new. And this transmission made me feel pretty darn good. I'm excited when I get this bolted into my car. I'm going to know what it's all about. You know, I found a Camaro transmission and some S10 goodies. I was able to scavenge from a broken transmission, and I made myself a hot rod transmission. It's going to put the shifter just in the right place for my little Model A Roadster. I'm super excited. This thing shifts smooth. I'm going to add some ATF fluid, bolt it up in the car, and we're going to be ready to go. So hope that helped you out. Maybe you learned something. At any rate, we're always happy when you stop by here at Speedway Motors. Visit our website, speedwaymotors.com. Subscribe to our YouTube page. Ask me questions if you have any right here on Facebook or anywhere else, and I'll get right back to you. We love having you visit us here at Speedway Motors and hope you take care. Until next time, folks.